He was taking my deepest vulnerability and holding it up for his family's inspection, twisting it into an anecdote to serve his own ambition. And I saw it in her then, Richard declared, his voice swelling with magnanimity, not a charity case, but a chance. A chance to show what the Davenport name truly means. It means lifting people up. It means providing a foundation for those who have none. I gave her my name, a home, a life she could never have dreamed of. And in doing so, I learned what it means to be a true leader. It's not about what you have, it's about what you give to those less fortunate. He raised his glass. So I toast not just to our family's future, but to the spirit of compassion that will guide it. The room erupted in polite, appreciative applause. Several family members smiled at me, their eyes filled with a new, sickening pity. They weren't seeing a strong, capable woman. They were seeing the pitiful little orphan from the story, a stray dog Richard had rescued from the street. In 30 seconds, he had stripped me of a decade of dignity, erasing the woman I had become and replacing her with the pathetic, helpless girl he had found. He hadn't just betrayed me. He had unmade me. I sat there, frozen, my face a burning mask of humiliation. I could feel Julian's eyes on me from across the table, a flicker of what looked like genuine shock in his expression before it was replaced by a cool, calculating neutrality. Richard sat down, flushed with success. He had done it. He had won. He had sacrificed his queen to take the board, and he didn't even have the decency to look ashamed. I don't remember the rest of the dinner. I moved in a fog of disbelief and a pain so sharp it was almost physical. As soon as the guests began to mingle, I fled the dining room, my heart hammering against my ribs. I found Richard in the library, accepting congratulations from his great-uncle. He was beaming. When we were finally alone, I confronted him, my voice a raw, trembling whisper. "How could you, Richard? How could you do that to me?" He sighed, the triumphant smile vanishing, replaced by an expression of weary impatience. "Oh, Clara, don't be so dramatic. It was just a story, a tool. It worked. Didn't you see their faces? They saw me as a man of substance, of compassion. You used my pain," I choked out, tears finally breaking free. "You took the most private, painful part of my life, and you sold it for a promotion." He took a step closer, his face hardening. "I did what was necessary. For us, for our future. I have been working towards this my entire life. I expected you, of all people, to understand the importance of a small sacrifice. You're being overly emotional. It's time you grew up and understood how the world really works." And in that moment, the man I thought I loved vanished completely. All that was left was a cold, ambitious stranger who saw me not as a partner, but as an asset, a tool to be used and discarded. The gilded cage he had built for me wasn't for my protection. It was for his convenience. The love I thought we shared wasn't real. It was just another one of his well-managed investments. And it had just matured. I walked out of the library and did not look back. The decision was not a conscious thought. It was a primal, instinctual act of survival, like pulling your hand from a fire. I went upstairs to our opulent guest suite, my movements stiff and robotic. The sounds of the party, the laughter, and clinking glasses drifted up from downstairs, a grotesque soundtrack to the demolition of my life. I didn't pack a suitcase. I didn't take the designer clothes Richard had bought me or the jewelry that felt like golden shackles on my skin. I opened my handbag and took out my wallet. Then I walked to the bottom of the antique armoire where a small, dusty shoebox was hidden. It was the only thing I had brought with me into this marriage, the sum total of my life before Richard. Inside were a few faded photographs, my adoption papers, and a worn copy of Jane Eyre. It was my emergency kit, the proof that I had existed. Before him, and I prayed, would exist after him. I slipped out of the manor through a side door used by the staff, my heart pounding with a mixture of terror and a strange, exhilarating sense of freedom. The night air was cool and damp, and for the first time in 10 years, it felt like I could actually breathe. I walked down the long, gravel driveway, the crunch of my footsteps the only sound in the night. I didn't know where I was going. I just knew I was leaving. I walked for what felt like hours until the distant lights of a small town appeared. I found a bus station, a sad, fluorescent-lit box that smelled of disinfectant and despair. I looked at the departure board, a list of places that meant nothing to me. I bought a ticket to the nearest city, a place where I could disappear. The next few days passed in a blur of cheap motels and the gnawing ache of loneliness. The reality of my situation was stark. Richard controlled all our finances. My name was on a joint checking account, but I knew he would have frozen it the moment he realized I was gone. I had a few $100s in cash. I had no friends to call. Richard had systematically isolated me from my old college acquaintances, subtly disapproving of anyone who was mine and not ours. I had no family. I was 52 years old, and I was utterly, terrifyingly alone. One night, sitting on the lumpy bed of a motel room that smelled of stale smoke, I opened my shoebox. I needed to see them. The artifacts of my former self. I looked at the faded photo of my mother, a beautiful, sad-eyed young woman holding a baby me. I never knew her name. The adoption was closed. She was a ghost, a question mark at the beginning of my life. I picked up the small, tarnished silver locket that had been pinned to my baby blanket when I was left at the orphanage. It was my oldest possession. I had opened it 1,000 times. As a child, always hoping a magical secret picture would appear inside. It was always empty tonight, driven by a desperation I couldn't name. I examined it more closely than ever before. I ran my thumbnail along the inner rim, and I felt a tiny catch, a false bottom. My fingers trembled as I pried at it. A minuscule, wafer-thin piece of metal popped open, revealing a hidden compartment no bigger than my pinky nail. Inside was a tiny, tightly folded square of brittle, yellowed paper. My breath caught in my throat. With the care of an archaeologist, unearthing a priceless relic, I unfolded it. On the paper, written in a faded, elegant cursive, were two things: a name and a place. Sarah Gable, Port Blossom, Maine. The words seemed to shimmer in the dim motel light. It wasn't a letter. It wasn't an explanation. It was just a clue. A single fragile thread stretching back through 52 years of not knowing. Who was Sarah Gable? A friend of my mother's? A relative? Why this name, this place, hidden away for decades? For the first time since I fled Blackwood Manor, a feeling other than pain or fear sparked within me. It was for a purpose. Richard had tried to define me by my past, to use my rootlessness as a tool for his own gain. But what if he was wrong? What if I wasn't a blank slate? What if I had roots I never knew existed? The next morning, I walked into a pawn shop. I took off the heavy diamond engagement ring Richard had given me, the symbol of my gilded cage, and placed it on the counter. It felt like removing a handcuff. The pawnbroker's eyes widened. "This is quite the piece, ma'am," he said. "I know," I replied. "I want to sell it." I walked out of that shop with a thick wad of cash and a lightness in my step I hadn't felt in years. I went back to the bus station, but this time I knew my destination. I bought a one-way ticket to Port Blossom, Maine. I was done running away from a life that was a lie. I was running towards the first and only hope of a truth that was my own. The journey to Maine was a slow, rattling transition from one world to another. The manicured landscapes of Connecticut gave way to the rugged, untamed beauty of the northern coast. The bus deposited me in Port Blossom, a town that felt like it had been carved from salt-sprayed rock and stubborn pine trees. The air smelled of low tide, wood smoke, and freedom. It was the antithesis of Blackwood Manor, real, raw, and beautifully imperfect. I felt a tremor of fear. What was I doing here? Chasing a name on a scrap of paper found in a 50-year-old locket? It was insane. I was a fool, grasping at straws. For a moment, the voice of Richard, of Eleanor, echoed in my head, mocking my emotional, impulsive nature. I almost turned around and bought a ticket back to the anonymous safety of the city. But then I thought of the pity in their eyes at that dinner table, and my resolve hardened. I would rather be a fool on my own terms than a prized possession on theirs. I found the address from the locket on a cobblestone street overlooking the harbor. It wasn't a house, but a bookstore. A beautiful, chaotic, wonderful bookstore called The Rested Anchor. The windows were crammed with towers of secondhand books. The paint on the door was a cheerful, peeling blue, and a fat, ginger cat was asleep in a patch of sun on the steps. It felt more like home than Blackwood Manor ever had. Taking a deep breath, I pushed open the door. A small bell chimed. The inside smelled of old paper, brewing tea, and the sea. Books were everywhere, stacked on shelves that reached the ceiling, piled on tables, overflowing from wicker baskets. Behind a counter stood a woman with a cloud of wild, silver-streaked hair tied back with a silk scarf. She wore paint-splattered overalls over a cozy sweater, and she was peering at me over a pair of reading glasses with eyes the color of a stormy sea. They were the same eyes that stared back at me from the faded photograph in my shoebox. My voice was S. The air at Blackwood Manor always smelled of three things: old money, lemon polish, and quiet, suffocating judgment. It was the ancestral home of the Davenport family, a sprawling stone behemoth in the heart of Connecticut that wore its history like a shroud. For 10 years, I had walked its polished floors as Clara Davenport, wife of Richard Davenport, the heir apparent to the Davenport and Sons financial empire. But I never felt like Davenport. I felt like a carefully curated artifact Richard had acquired, one he would occasionally take out, dust off, and display before putting me back in my gilded cage. My life before Richard was a sepia-toned photograph of forgotten memories. I was an orphan, a product of a system that had left me with a profound sense of rootlessness and a deep, aching need to belong. I met Richard in my final year of college, where I was studying art history on a scholarship that barely covered my existence. He was everything I wasn't: confident, wealthy, with a lineage that stretched back to the Mayflower. He pursued me with a relentless, charming focus that felt like sunshine after a lifetime of gray skies. He told me he loved my authenticity, my unspoiled view of the world. He said he wanted to protect me. I mistook possession for protection and gratitude for love when he proposed, presenting me with a diamond that felt heavier than my entire past. I believed I had finally found my home, my anchor. I was wrong. I had merely exchanged one institution for another. The Davenport family, ruled by its formidable matriarch, Eleanor, Richard's mother, accepted me with the same enthusiasm one might show a piece of modern art they were forced to display in their classical gallery with polite, icy tolerance. To them, I was a curiosity, the orphan girl Richard had inexplicably chosen. They saw my humble origins not as a testament to my resilience, but as a stain they had to perpetually overlook. My lack of pedigree was my original sin. Eleanor, in particular, was a master of the subtle wound. She would compliment my dress by saying, "It's amazing what good tailoring can do for simple fabric," or praise my decorating by noting, "You have such a bohemian touch, so different from what we're used to." Each compliment was a beautifully wrapped insult, a reminder that I was, and always would be, an outsider. Richard, in those early years, played the part of my defender. He would squeeze my hand under the dinner table or whisper reassurances in my ear. "Don't mind them, darling," he'd say. "They're just from a different era. It's you I love." And I would cling to those words, using them to build a fortress around my heart, but over the decade, the fortress began to crumble from within. Richard's defense of me slowly morphed into a form of management. He started correcting me, gently. At first, then with an edge of impatience. "Clara, darling, perhaps don't share that story about your time in the foster home. It makes people uncomfortable. Or, let's not wear that dress to the club. It's a bit loud. Let's stick to the classics." He was sanding down my edges, trying to make me fit into the smooth, polished puzzle of his world. I was so desperate to belong that I allowed myself to be reshaped, piece by painful piece, which brought us to the annual Davenport family reunion. It was less a reunion and more a corporate summit disguised as a garden party. It was the one weekend, a year where every branch of the sprawling Davenport family tree convened at Blackwood Manor to engage in a bloodless battle of passive aggression, veiled insults, and strategic alliances. This year, however, was different. This year was critical. The longtime CEO of Davenport and Sons was retiring. The two frontrunners for the position were Richard and his cousin, a cold, calculating man named Julian. The board was composed almost entirely of senior family members, and the reunion was Richard's final, most important stage to prove he was the superior choice. His entire future, he reminded me daily, hinged on this weekend. The pressure he put on me was immense. For weeks, leading up to the event, he coached me like an actress preparing for a role. He vetted my wardrobe, corrected my posture, and quizzed me on the names, titles, and subtle grievances of every distant aunt and uncle. "You have to be perfect, Clara," he said the night before we left, his hands gripping my shoulders, his eyes holding a cold, heart glint I had never seen before. No sad stories, no artistic opinions. Just smiles, polite agreement, and unwavering support for me. "Can you do that? Can you just be the perfect wife for 2 days?" His words stung, but I pushed the hurt down. His dream had become my dream. His success was my success. That was the contract of our marriage. Of course, Richard, I said, my voice a soft echo of the woman I used to be. I won't let you down. As we drove through the imposing iron gates of Blackwood Manor the next day, a sense of dread settled deep in my bones. The air was already thick with the scent of roses and unspoken rivalries. Eleanor greeted us at the door, her smile as thin as a razor's edge. She kissed Richard's cheek, then gave me a look that traveled from my shoes to my hair, a silent, comprehensive critique. Clara, she said, her voice like chilled champagne, how nice of you to join us. The first day was a blur of forced smiles and painfully stilted conversations. I was a ghost at the feast, drifting between conversations about stock portfolios and yacht maintenance, my presence acknowledged but never truly welcomed. I saw Julian and his wife, a woman born and bred for this world, moving through the crowd, with an easy, inherited grace that I could never hope to replicate. I saw the way the senior family members watched Richard, their eyes like calculating chips of ice. And I saw the way Richard watched me, a constant, low-level surveillance, his jaw tight with anxiety. I retreated to the gardens for a moment of respite, the scent of damp earth, a welcome relief from the cloying perfume of the party. I thought of the girl I used to be, the one who loved the smell of turpentine and old books, the one who dreamed of discovering lost art, not of marrying into a dynasty. Where had she gone? Had Richard saved me, or had he simply erased me? That evening, at the grand family dinner, the air in the formal dining room crackled with tension. The long mahogany table gleamed under the weight of ancestral silver and crystal. This was it. This was the main event. After the meal, Richard and Julian would each be expected to give a short, informal speech, a final appeal to the family board. As dessert was served, Richard caught my eye from across the table. He gave me a small, tight nod, a silent command. Be ready. Be perfect. I straightened my back, plastered a serene smile on my face, and prepared for the final act of my performance. I had no idea that the role he had written for me was not that of the supportive wife, but of the sacrificial lamb. The moment arrived with the clinking of a silver spoon against a crystal glass. Richard's great-uncle, the formidable patriarch and chairman of the board, stood up. His gaze swept across the table, lingering for a moment on Richard, then on Julian. As you all know, he began, his voice a low rumble, we are at a pivotal moment for the future of this family and our company. Tonight, we'd like to hear a few words from the two young men who hope to lead us into the next generation. Richard, why don't you begin? A hush fell over the room. Every eye turned to my husband. Richard stood up, the picture of calm confidence. He looked handsome and powerful in his bespoke suit, a man born to lead. He smiled, a warm, charming smile that didn't quite reach his eyes. He started by speaking of tradition, of legacy, of the great responsibility that came with the Davenport name. He was eloquent, polished, and completely captivating. I felt a swell of pride, the loyal wife playing her part. He was winning them over. But legacy, Richard continued, his voice taking on a more intimate, reflective tone, is not just about where we come from. It's about what we build. It's about the values we uphold. It's about understanding that true strength isn't just inherited. It's forged in compassion and humility. He paused, and his eyes found mine across the table. I smiled back at him, a soft, encouraging smile. And then he turned that smile into a weapon and aimed it directly at my heart. Take my beautiful wife. Clara, for example, he said, his voice dripping with a false, benevolent warmth. The entire table turned to look at me. I felt a hot blush creep up my neck, unprepared for the sudden spotlight. Many of you know Clara's story, but it bears repeating. For it is a story of the Davenport spirit of generosity, he went on. The room was utterly silent. When I met her, she was a girl with absolutely nothing. An orphan, adrift in the world, with no family, no name, no prospects to speak of. A scholarship student, bless her heart, trying to make her way in a world that had dealt her a very cruel hand. My smile froze on my face. The blood drained from my head, and the room began to tilt. This wasn't happening. He wouldn't. I remember the first time I brought her here to this very house, he said, a soft, patronizing chuckle in his voice. She had never seen such a place. She told me the most heartbreaking story about her time in state-run homes, about how she had a single tattered photograph of her mother, the only thing she owned in the entire world, and how she kept it hidden under her pillow because she was afraid the other children would steal it. He was revealing the most sacred, painful secret of my childhood, a story I had whispered to him one night in the dark, a story I had never told another living soul. My mother's eyes thought my voice was stuck in my throat. I couldn't speak. I simply walked to the counter, my hands trembling, and placed the tarnished silver locket on the worn wooden surface. The woman looked from the locket to my face and her own. Face crumpled. The book she was holding slipped from her fingers and fell to the floor with a soft thud. "Oh, my dear God," she whispered, her hand flying to her mouth. "Lillian? No. You can't be. You're her daughter." Tears streamed down my face as I managed a single choked nod. "I'm Sarah," she said, her own eyes welling up. "I'm Sarah Gable. Your mother, Lillian, was my little sister." She came around the counter and wrapped me in a hug that felt like coming home after a lifetime in exile. It was a hug that held 52 years of secret sorrow and unspoken love. In the cozy, cluttered back room of the bookstore, over cups of chamomile tea, she told me the story I had been waiting my entire life to hear. My mother, Lillian Gable, was a brilliant, passionate artist from this small fishing town. She had fallen deeply in love with a young man from away, a summer visitor from a wealthy, powerful family. When she discovered she was pregnant, she was overjoyed. But his family was horrified. They were a rival dynasty to the Davenports, another old money clan, and the idea of their son marrying a nobody from a fishing village was unthinkable. They gave him an ultimatum, the girl or his inheritance. He chose the inheritance. Heartbroken and disowned by his family, my father vanished from her life. Lillian, facing the scandal alone, made the most difficult decision of her life. She gave me up for adoption, believing it was the only way to give me a life free from the stigma and poverty that would have defined my existence in Port Blossom. She made Sarah promise to never look for me, to let me have a clean slate. The locket was her one act of defiance, a single desperate breadcrumb dropped into the dark forest of my future, in the faint hope that I might one day find my way back. Lillian had died of pneumonia just 5 years after I was born. Her heart, Sarah said, never truly healing from the loss of her child and the man she loved. "She loved you so much, Clara," Sarah wept, clutching my hand. "She talked about you every day. She painted hundreds of pictures of you, imagining what you would look like as you grew. Giving you up broke her. That afternoon, I met the rest of my family. My uncle, Sarah's husband, was a gruff, bear-like fisherman named Ben, whose calloused hands were surprisingly gentle. He looked me up and down, grunted, and then pulled me into a hug that smelled of salt and diesel. "About time you came home," was all he said. I met my cousins, Ben and Sarah's grown children, who welcomed me with boisterous laughter, endless questions, and an immediate, unconditional acceptance that was utterly foreign to me. They weren't polished or powerful. They were loud, messy, and real. They showed me pictures of my mother, told me stories of her fiery spirit and her infectious laugh. For the first time, she wasn't a sad-eyed ghost in a photograph. She was a person. And through her, I was becoming a person too. That night, I slept in a small guest room above the bookstore, the sound of the foghorn a comforting lullaby. I was surrounded by the scent of old books and the sea, and for the first time in my life, I felt no sense of rootlessness. The empty space inside me, the one I had tried to fill with Richard's love and the Davenport name, was now filled with the stories and faces of my true family. One had been stripped of a fortune, a mansion, and a famous name. And in their place, I had found something infinitely more valuable. I had found myself. The next 6 months were an education in the art of living. I shed the skin of Clara Davenport, and slowly, joyfully, became Clara Gable. I worked in the bookstore with Sarah, my days filled with the quiet pleasure of recommending books, talking to the quirky locals, and learning the stories of my ancestors. I learned to mend fishing nets. With my Uncle Ben, my hands, once soft and manicured, growing strong and capable. I learned to laugh from my belly with my cousins, to argue about politics over a lobster dinner, to feel the simple, profound joy of belonging. I rediscovered my own mind. Away from Richard's subtle gaslighting, the fog in my head lifted. The dizziness vanished. The fatigue was replaced by a vibrant energy. I realized with a sickening clarity that my cognitive decline hadn't been a disease at all. It had been a symptom of the poison in my life, the constant stress, the emotional abuse, and perhaps something more tangible. I shuddered to think what might have been in the special herbal teas Richard had so lovingly prepared for me. I filed for divorce. A simple, clean break. My lawyer informed me that Richard didn't contest it. In fact, He seemed eager to have it finalized. The story of his speech at the reunion, I learned through a small news clipping Maya would have been proud of, had backfired spectacularly. Instead of seeing him as a compassionate leader, the board members had seen his act for what it was, a display of breathtaking cruelty and poor judgment. A man who would humiliate his own wife for personal gain could not be trusted to run a billion-dollar company. The CEO position went to his cousin Julian. One crisp autumn afternoon, as I was closing up the bookstore, a sleek black sedan, as out of place as a shark in a koi pond, pulled up outside. Richard stepped out. He looked thinner, his expensive suit hanging slightly off his frame. The confident swagger was gone, replaced by a weary, desperate air. He walked into the store, his eyes taking in the chaotic warmth, the piles of books, the scent of old paper. He looked at me, and my comfortable jeans and paint-splattered sweater, and a flicker of his old arrogance returned. "Clara," he said, his voice attempting a familiar, condescending softness, "I've been worried sick. Look, at this place, look at you. This isn't your life." "You're right, Richard," I said, my voice calm and steady. "It isn't. My life was the one you built for me, and it was a cage. This," I said, gesturing around the book-filled room, "this is my home." "I was wrong," he said, taking a step closer. "I made a mistake. The pressure, it got to me. But the CEO position is gone now. It doesn't matter anymore. I want you to come home. I miss you." It was his final, most audacious performance, the contrite husband begging for forgiveness. But I wasn't his audience anymore. I could see the strings, the careful manipulation in his eyes. He didn't miss me. He missed the asset I represented, the perfect, grateful, controllable wife who made him look good. "No," I said simply. He looked stunned. He had never heard that word from me before. "No, Clara, be reasonable. What do you have here?" "A dusty little shop, a few fishermen. I can give you everything." "You can't give me anything I want, Richard," I said, a true, genuine smile spreading across my face. "Because I already have it. I have a family that loves me for who I am, not for who they want me to be. I have a history. I have roots. Do you know what the funniest part of all this is? My mother was a Gable, but my father, his family and yours have been bitter rivals for over a century. The orphan you pitted so much has a lineage just as powerful as your own. You just never thought to ask about her." The shock on his face was absolute. It was the look of a chess master who had just been checkmated by a pawn he had ignored for the entire game. Just then, the back door of the shop opened, and my Uncle Ben came in, carrying a crate of fresh clams. He saw Richard and his friendly face hardened into granite. He set the crate down with a heavy thud and came to stand beside me, his presence a silent, immovable mountain. Richard looked from my uncle's weathered face to mine. He saw no fear, no regret, no trace of the timid woman he had married. He saw a stranger. Defeated, he turned without another word and walked out of the bookstore, out of my life, forever. As his car disappeared down the cobblestone street, I looked around the cluttered, beautiful shop. I looked at the books that held a million stories, and at my uncle, who was part of my own. That one act of breathtaking cruelty at the family reunion, the moment that was designed to be my ultimate humiliation, had become my liberation. Richard had tried to unmake me by reminding me I came from nothing. But in doing so, he had accidentally sent me home, leading me to the one thing he could never have, and I could never lose, a true family. And for the first time, I was not just authenticating the stories of others. I was finally living on my own,